Pennsylvania's death row holds some of the most violent criminals in the state's history. Men convicted of horrific crimes now waiting for their execution. But before we start, let us know whether the death penalty is still used in your state. George Banks. September 25, 1982. The quiet of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania was shattered when George, armed with an AR-15, went on a killing spree that left 13 people dead, including 5 of his own children, 3 former girlfriends, and several innocent bystanders. George, a former prison guard and ex-convict, believed he was saving his children from a corrupt world. When police finally found him, George had locked himself in a house, leading to a tense standoff. He eventually surrendered, but his trial would be one of the most shocking in Pennsylvania history. A jury convicted him on multiple counts of first-degree murder, and in 1983 he was sentenced to death. Over the years, his lawyers have argued that George suffers from severe mental illness, preventing his execution. Now 82 years old, George has spent more than 4 decades on death row. His case is currently not under active appeal, and no execution date has been scheduled. But if you thought this case was shocking, the next one is even more disturbing. Raghunandan Yandamuri. In October 2012, 26-year-old Raghunandan was drowning in gambling debt after losing at least $15,000 at a casino. Desperate for money, he came up with a plan to kidnap 10-month-old Sanvi Vena for ransom, believing her parents had $50,000 to pay. Raghunandan lived in the same apartment complex as the family and had even attended the mother's birthday party. On the day of the crime, he broke into their apartment, thinking he could take the baby easily. But Sanvi's grandmother, 61-year-old Satyavati Vena, was home and tried to protect her granddaughter. Raghunandan panicked and stabbed her to death. He then took the baby and fled. Tragically, baby Sanvi died shortly after. When police caught him, he first confessed, but later said he was forced to. The evidence against him was strong, including his own videotaped confession. The jury found him guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, and in 2014, he was sentenced to death. 38-year-old Raghunandan Yandamuri has spent over a decade on Pennsylvania's death row. His case remains under appeal, and no execution date has been scheduled. Michael Ballard. Michael had already served time for murder when he struck again in 2010. This time, in a crime so brutal it sent shockwaves through Pennsylvania. Michael was enraged when his ex-girlfriend Denise Murhai ended their relationship. She had moved on with another man while he was locked up for failing to complete court-ordered anger management therapy. That day, he went to her home in Northampton, Pennsylvania, and attacked her, stabbing her 45 times. Her father, grandfather, and a neighbor who tried to help were also murdered in the rampage. The victims suffered a total of 88 stab wounds. Michael fled the scene covered in blood, but crashed his car and was quickly captured. His confession left no doubt about his guilt, and prosecutors wasted no time seeking the death penalty. In 2011, Michael pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder, and the jury sentenced him to death. His legal team has since argued that his violent past and mental health issues should have been considered, but the courts have upheld his sentence. In 2015, Michael gave up his right to more appeals, bringing him closer to execution. Now 41 years old, Michael has spent nearly 13 years on death row. No execution date has been scheduled. Harvey Miguel Robinson. In the early 1990s, a serial killer was hunting women in Allentown, Pennsylvania. At just 17 years old, he was already a violent predator. Harvey raped and murdered 3 women: Joan Berghardt, a 29-year-old nurse's aide, Charlotte Schmoyer, a 15-year-old newspaper carrier, and Jessica Fortney, a 47-year-old grandmother. His attacks were savage, with his victims brutally beaten and strangled. Harvey's downfall came when he targeted a woman who survived. She fought him off, and DNA evidence led police straight to him. In 1994, a jury convicted him of multiple counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death. He remains one of the youngest serial killers in U.S. history. In April 2024, a federal court rejected his final appeal, keeping his death sentence in place. Now 49 years old, Harvey has spent more than 30 years on death row. What do you think? Should the death penalty still be used, or is life in prison enough? John Eichinger. John's crime started with obsession. In 1999, he went to Jennifer Still's home to confess his feelings for her. But when Jennifer rejected him, he snapped. He pulled out a knife he had hidden and brutally stabbed her multiple times, ultimately inflicting a fatal neck injury. Jennifer's lifeless body was discovered later that day, but the case went cold due to a lack of leads. For 5 years, John kept the bloodied knife, gloves, and clothing as twisted souvenirs. Every Halloween, he would take out the knife, wear a Scream Ghostface mask, and go trick-or-treating. Then, in 2005, he killed again. This time, his victims were Heather Greaves, her sister Lisa, and Heather's 3-year-old daughter Avery. John went to their house under the disguise of delivering flowers for her upcoming birthday. But he brought more than flowers. He brought the same knife. Again, he confessed his feelings. Again, he was rejected. Again, he attacked in a similar way. And that was not it. After stabbing Heather, he murdered Lisa and Avery to eliminate witnesses. But the police quickly connected him to the crimes, and he confessed. John was sentenced to death later that year. Now, 52 years old, he has spent nearly 20 years on death row. His case remains under appeal, and no execution date has been set. Robert Diamond. In August 2008, Robert, a former forklift operator at a publishing company in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, was terminated from his job. Believing he was the victim of racially motivated harassment, he sought revenge. On August 1, 2008, he returned to his former workplace armed with a firearm. He fatally shot 2 employees, Reginald Woodson, who was black, and Angel Guadalupe, who was Latino. Robert was quickly arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. During his trial, the prosecution argued that his actions were premeditated and driven by racial animosity. The defense, however, claimed that Robert suffered from mental health issues, including paranoia and delusions. In 2009, Robert was convicted and sentenced to death. Now, Robert Diamond has spent over 15 years on Pennsylvania's death row. His case remains under appeal, and no execution date has been scheduled. Melvin Knight and Ricky Smyrns. In 2010, Ricky, Melvin, and 4 others took part in the brutal murder of 30-year-old Jennifer Doherty, a woman with an intellectual disability. They tricked Jennifer into coming to Ricky Smyrns' apartment by pretending to be her friends. Over several days, Jennifer endured unimaginable torture. The group, led by Ricky, subjected her to physical abuse, humiliation, and forced consumption of vile substances. The torment ended on February 11, 2010, when Melvin, under pressure from Ricky, stabbed Jennifer multiple times. The group then concealed her body in a garbage can, discarding it in a school parking lot. Melvin and Ricky were arrested and in 2012 pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. A jury subsequently sentenced both of them to death. Now 35 and 38 years old, Melvin and Ricky have spent over a decade on death row. Their cases remain under appeal, with the defense citing factors such as troubled upbringing and mental health challenges. No execution date has been set. Alfonso Sanchez. In October 2007, 23-year-old Alfonso went to an apartment in Warminster Township, Pennsylvania, with 2 friends. They claimed they were there to buy marijuana, but things quickly turned violent. Inside, an argument started over something as small as stepping on someone's shoe. During the fight, Alfonso pulled out a gun and shot one of the men, Mendez Thomas, in the head, killing him. Then he turned the gun on Lisa Diaz, shooting her multiple times, including once in the head. Lisa's sister was also shot in the knee while trying to protect her child, but survived. In 2008, a jury found Alfonso guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death. While waiting for the retrial, authorities uncovered a plot where Alfonso tried to have the surviving witness killed. In May 2023, a jury once again found him guilty and sentenced him to death. Now 41 years old, Alfonso remains on death row. His case is still under appeal, and no execution date has been set. Andre Staten. In February 2004, 26-year-old Beverly Yon was afraid of her ex-boyfriend, Andre Staten. She got a restraining order to keep him away, but it didn't stop him. On February 25th, he broke into her home in Altoona, Pennsylvania, where she lived with her mother and 3 young children. In front of one of her sons, Andre attacked her, stabbing her multiple times before running away. Police caught him a few days later in Baltimore, Maryland. At his trial in 2006, a jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death. Andre has caused problems in court over the years. In 2013, during an appeal hearing, he attacked his own lawyer, which led to more charges and made his legal process even more difficult. And in 2015, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court rejected his appeal and upheld his conviction. Even though an execution date was set in 2016, legal challenges and questions about his mental health have kept it from happening. Now 60 years old, Andre has spent nearly 20 years on death row. Richard Baumhammers. April 28, 2000. Richard set out on a racially motivated killing spree that would leave 5 people dead and an entire community shaken. His first victim was his elderly Jewish neighbor and longtime family friend, Anita Gordon, whom he shot before setting her house on fire. He then drove across Pittsburgh, targeting individuals based on their ethnicity. He murdered an Indian immigrant, a black man, and 2 Asian American restaurant workers. Before his rampage ended, he had also vandalized 2 synagogues, spray painting swastikas on the buildings. Police arrested him hours later. At trial, prosecutors painted him as a hate-fueled killer with a deep history of racist beliefs. His defense attempted to argue insanity, but the jury didn't buy it. Richard was convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death in 2001. His appeals have continued for more than 2 decades, but his death sentence remains in place. Now 58 years old, Richard has spent over 23 years on death row. No execution date has been scheduled. Richard Boxley. In June 1997, Richard was involved in the shooting death of Jason Bolton in Reading, Pennsylvania. Richard and his associate, Jose Busanet, planned to confront Bolton over a previous dispute involving stolen drug money. They tracked him down on the street, and during the confrontation, both Richard and Jose opened fire, resulting in Jason's death. Witnesses testified that after the shooting, Richard and his accomplices fled the scene and later celebrated the act. In 2000, Richard was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Over the years, Richard has filed multiple appeals, including claims of ineffective assistance of counsel and challenges to the evidence presented at trial. Richard, now 56 years old, remains on death row in Pennsylvania. His case is still under appeal, and no execution date has been scheduled. Jerry Chambers. In 2003, Jerry and his girlfriend, Candace Geiger, lived in a Philadelphia apartment with Candace's 4 young daughters. The children, aged between 10 months and 6 years, endured severe abuse at the hands of Jerry and Candace. Neighbors and relatives reported hearing the children scream and cry, but the abuse continued unchecked. Tragically, on August 17, 2003, 3-year-old Portia Bennett was found dead, wedged between a mattress and a bedroom wall. According to court documents, Jerry became angry when he noticed her witnessing him and her aunt being intimate. An autopsy revealed she had suffered multiple injuries over time, including broken bones, burns, and bruises. The cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation. Following Porcia's death, the surviving sisters recounted the horrific abuse they had suffered, detailing how Jerry and Candace beat them with belts, cords, and other objects. The children also described being forced to stand in painful positions for extended periods as punishment. In 2005, Jerry Chambers was convicted of first-degree murder, conspiracy, aggravated assault, and multiple counts of endangering the welfare of a child. He was sentenced to death for Porcia's murder. 53-year-old Jerry has been on death row for almost 20 years, with ongoing appeals and no execution date scheduled. Some crimes make no sense, and this next one is just as disturbing. Kevin Dowling. In August 1995, Jennifer Myers, who owned an art gallery in Spring Grove, Pennsylvania, was attacked. A man robbed and assaulted her. Days later, she saw Kevin working at a nearby convenience store and recognized him as her attacker. She informed the police, leading to Kevin's arrest on charges of robbery and assault. He was released on bail and awaited trial. 2 days before the trial, in October 1997, Jennifer was found dead in her gallery, shot 3 times. Witnesses reported hearing gunshots around 1 p.m. Kevin claimed he was fishing at Muddy Run Lake, about an hour's drive away at that time. However, investigators discovered he had tampered with evidence to create a false alibi. Additionally, Kevin had written a letter to Jennifer admitting to the previous attack. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Kevin, who is now 65 years old, has been on death row for over 25 years, with ongoing appeals, and no execution date has been set. Troy Drumheller. In 1999, 38-year-old Troy Drumheller violated a restraining order to confront his former girlfriend, Carol Huttenstein, who had accused him of domestic violence, and was set to testify against him. On April 24th, Carol sought refuge at a friend's mobile home after Troy had allegedly broken into her house and assaulted her. Around 1:30 a.m., a loud noise startled them. Troy had arrived armed, forcing his way inside Robert Brockway's place. Witnesses later testified that he stabbed Carol up to 21 times. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Now 63, Troy has spent over 25 years on Pennsylvania's death row, with no execution date scheduled. Stephen Duffy. In February 1984, 19-year-old Kathy Kermchak worked as a waitress at Janetti's Manor when her body was discovered in the women's restroom. She had been stabbed approximately 30 times. During the investigation, witnesses reported seeing a yellow Chrysler LeBaron parked behind the restaurant around the time of the murder. This car belonged to 24-year-old Stephen Duffy, a former dishwasher at Janetti's Manor. Confronted with the evidence, Stephen confessed to the crime. He admitted to confronting Kathy in the restaurant's office, demanding money, and then leading her to the restroom. When she resisted, he attacked her with a butcher knife taken from the kitchen. In 1985, he was convicted of first-degree murder and robbery. He was sentenced to death. In 1994, he came within 30 hours of execution before receiving a temporary stay. Stephen, now 65 years old, has been on death row for 40 years. Stephen Rex Edmiston. In 1988, 2-year-old Bobby Jo Matthew lived with her family in Clearfield County, Pennsylvania. But on the night of October 4th, she was taken from her home. The next day, police questioned Stephen, the nephew of the grandmother's boyfriend. During the interrogation, Stephen drew a map leading officers to Bobby Jo's body. He allegedly told them they would find a dead, raped little girl. In 1989, Stephen was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death, along with additional prison terms for the other offenses. In 2014, Governor Tom Corbett signed an execution warrant for Stephen, scheduling it for April 16, 2014. However, legal challenges and stays have prevented the execution from taking place. Stephen, now 68 years old, remains on Pennsylvania's death row. His case continues to undergo legal review, and no execution date has been set. Randy Todd Hogg. In July 1982, Randy and his associates kidnapped Richard Good in Berks County, Pennsylvania. They restrained Richard, transported him to a secluded area, and fatally shot him. Randy and his accomplices then disposed of Richard's body in the Susquehanna River, wrapping it in pieces of carpet and weighing it down with chains and cinder blocks. The motive behind the crime was related to disputes over drug money owed by Richard to Randy and his associates. In February 1986, Randy was found guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping. He received a death sentence for the murder and an additional 10 to 20 years in prison for the kidnapping charge. As of now, no execution date has been scheduled. He is now 65 years old and has been on death row for almost 4 decades. Herbert Blakeney. In February 2000, Herbert got into a violent argument in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He went to the apartment where his estranged wife, Sasha, was staying with her friend, Dwana Swanson, and their children. After a heated argument earlier that day, he came back that night with a butcher knife. Herbert attacked Dwana, stabbing her several times. During the attack, he also inflicted a fatal neck injury of their 1-year-old son Basil, killing him. Police arrived while the attack was still happening and shot Herbert, but he survived. In 2002, a jury found him guilty of first-degree murder for Basil's death and attempted murder for attacking Dwana. He was sentenced to death. Over the years, he has tried to appeal his sentence, arguing against his conviction. In 2018, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court rejected his appeal, keeping his death sentence in place. Now 58 years old, Herbert has spent more than 20 years on Pennsylvania's death row. George Lopez. In 1995, George was convicted of murdering David Bolaski, an architect and landlord from Allentown, Pennsylvania. David had gone to one of his rental properties to collect $700 rent when he was attacked, robbed, and killed. His body was later found in a wooded area, tied up and wrapped in bedsheets. Investigators linked George and 2 other men, Edwin Romero and Miguel Moreno, to the crime. They were arrested and charged with murder. At trial, prosecutors argued that George was directly involved in the robbery and killing. In March 1996, a jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death. Since then, 52-year-old George has spent nearly 30 years on Pennsylvania's death row. He has always insisted he didn't commit the crime and has been fighting his conviction through appeals. No execution date has been scheduled. Anthony Reed. On July 9, 1988, a man called Mark Lisby stole $500 worth of cocaine from the Junior Black Mafia. When Mark admitted he couldn't pay, JBM enforcer Kevin Bowman was furious, and 2 days later, Anthony shot him while walking down the street, killing him instantly. And a few months later, Anthony struck again. On March 7, 1989, a group of kids threw snowballs at passing cars. One hit Anthony's vehicle. He parked his car on the sidewalk and shots were fired. 16-year-old Michael Waters was hit in the back and died instantly. 6 days later, Anthony and Kevin lured Neil Wilkinson and Darrell Woods to an apartment, pretending to collect a debt. And as they climbed the stairs, Kevin opened fire with a shotgun. Anthony followed with his handgun. Neil died on the spot, but Darrell survived and later identified Anthony as the shooter. Anthony was sentenced to death on April 19, 1990 for first-degree murder, conspiracy, and weapons violations. 58-year-old Anthony Reed has spent over 3 decades on death row in Pennsylvania. His case remains under appeal and no execution date has been set. That wraps up this video. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments.